Hello and welcome back for another Sheriff of Sodium video. It's been a while since I've publicly cleaned out the old inbox, so today I'm going to do just that with a special residency application mailbag on the personal statement. I'm doing that because a few weeks ago I put out a video on preference signaling, and I think this reached a somewhat different audience than I typically do. So if you're a new listener, welcome aboard and thanks for coming along for the ride. But I also got a few direct messages about other aspects of the residency application, so I figured I'd try to answer some of those questions here. And a lot of those were about the personal statement, and that seems like as good of a place to start as any. Although if I do find the time, I'll try to put out at least one more video later on to answer some of the other questions that I've gotten on other parts of the application. As always, these are real questions from real readers or listeners, though especially for this video, I've taken the liberty of making the particular question more broad and generic, both to maintain anonymity and to broaden the generalizability for other applicants. And as always, these are just my opinions. And it's possible, although I don't think it's at all likely, but I'll acknowledge it's at least possible, that some of my opinions might actually be wrong. And at the end of the day, you got to do what you think is right for you, not what some faceless man says to do on YouTube. So now, with no further ado, let's get to some of your questions. And our first question starts like this. I want to write a really creative personal statement. Okay, let me just stop you right there. This is almost always a bad idea. But to understand why, I want you to take a step back and think about why we have the personal statement at all. I mean, why do programs ask you to do this? How does it help them? And the answer is, I think that the personal statement may give programs two types of information that may help them evaluate you as an applicant. This is what they want out of the personal statement. One type of information is important stuff about you that isn't captured elsewhere. ARIS does a good job of collecting data about your educational background or your extracurricular activities or your publications, but its format doesn't necessarily get at significant life experiences that may make you a very compelling applicant. There's no field on ARIS to explain how you were a refugee from another country and how you overcame all those challenges to get to this point in your life, or how your mom's diagnosis and eventual death from cancer made you want to be a doctor and shape the way that you view medicine. But the personal statement gives you a way of conveying to programs that kind of information. The second type of information that the personal statement contains that's useful to programs is really more of a kind of meta information because no matter what you write about, your writing conveys information about your English language proficiency and your linearity of thought. So when you think about what a good personal statement is, I think it's a personal statement that succeeds on these two dimensions, either by communicating important personal information that's not captured elsewhere, or by conveying sound writing skills and logical thought patterns, or ideally, both of those things. But the converse of that is also true. The worst personal statements that I've ever read, they fail on those two dimensions. And look, as far as that first dimension goes, not everyone has an extremely compelling personal story to share. Many residency applicants, truth be told, have lived relatively boring, privileged, vanilla lives, and that's okay. They may go on to be very good residents and very capable physicians. Now, if you have something special in your life story, by all means, share it. This is not the time to be modest. But if you don't, and again, I'll be honest, many applicants don't feel obligated to try to manufacture some kind of hardship or drama. You can still talk honestly about why you chose that specialty and what you think you bring to the table. For most specialties, there are certain common shared experiences that lead people to pick that specialty. And if you're being honest and you convey sincerity, the things that you're writing about, they're going to ring true to the people who read it, even if those experiences are somewhat banal. But no applicant should fail on that second dimension, which is failing to convey sound English language proficiency and logical thought. No matter what you are writing about, you should be able to write about it in that way. But that's exactly the dimension where I've seen some extremely creative essays fail. So I've seen personal statements where all the actions that are described, they're described in the third person as if they're being observed by an extraterrestrial life form. And we're seeing the applicant do all these things. And I mean, it was creative, yeah, but it also made you wonder a little bit about what was going on in the author's head. Or I've seen personal statements where the author included an acrostic poem, the kind where the first letter of each sentence spells out a word with some significance, except the Eris formatting made it all jacked up, so it wasn't at all clear what was going on until you really studied the thing. I think too many applicants get caught up in this idea that their personal statement needs to be some kind of work of literature. Folks, you're not applying for an MFA program. You're applying to be a resident. And as a resident, the main thing you're going to be writing is progress notes and H&Ps and procedure notes and discharge summaries. And I'll tell you, it will certainly make you a better physician to have some facility with the written word. But no one is going to mistake your patient documentation for the next great American novel. So if you think you can do something very creative and pull it off, go for it. But I'd make sure that you have a somewhat large and diverse audience of trustworthy proofreaders to read it and give you honest feedback. Because there's a very real risk that you'll end up being too cute by half and end up missing the opportunity to show program directors the things that they actually want to see when they ask you to write a personal statement in the first place. Understand the personal statement is only going to matter on the margins. There are very few applicants who get an interview invitation or don't on the basis of their personal statement. If you have a personal statement that is competent and seems somewhat boring, that may be just fine for your personal situation. Let's move on to another question, which starts like this. I want to write a really personal statement. I've gotten several variations of this question this year from applicants who have something unique and personally meaningful that they want to talk about. Maybe they came out as being LGBTQ in medical school, or they struggled with a mental health problem or a physical ailment, and they want to share how those things impacted their medical education and their outlook on residency. I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to write about those things if you know what you're doing. And what I mean is, as the people who are considering writing personal statements like this already very well know, we live in a world in which if you're LGBTQ or you have physical or mental health conditions, there are some people who would rather not have you come around. That's the reality. And so if you put this information in your personal statement, well, it may be read by one of those people, or it may be read by someone who cares about not upsetting one of those people, and they may decide not to interview you. So if your only concern is creating as many opportunities for graduate medical education as possible, my advice would be not to include those things in your personal statement. On the other hand, if you're not just interested in the number of interview offers you receive, but you're interested primarily in the goodness of fit between you and your future residency program, then maybe you do include them. And if that turns some people off, well, be turned off because you want to be in a place that supports you. So for this question, I don't have any broad one-size-fits-all advice. It depends on your personal circumstances and your values. If you're a strong applicant who's not worried about going unmatched, I think it makes a lot of sense to say who you are and let programs that aren't a good fit identify themselves as such. It'll make your job easier. On the other hand, if you're a weaker applicant or you're an international medical graduate or someone who's trying to get an opportunity at a highly selective field, I think then you might want to be a little bit more conservative about what information you disclose and when. All right, next question. Do I have to include a patient presentation in my personal statement? And the answer here is clearly no. No, you do not. But the fact that I've gotten this question twice goes to show how there's become this certain house style of personal statement that's very common, especially among US medical school graduates. And it's this style where the personal statement sort of starts with a cold open on some medical scene. Drip, drip, drip. I watched the IV fluid drip into my patient as I stood exhausted at the bedside after an 8-hour surgical case. The patient was a 68-year-old gentleman with pancreatic cancer, and it was my first Whipple. Or beep, beep, beep. The graphs on the monitor cascaded up as mechanical breaths washed in and out. I looked across the bed at the ICU attending and racked my brain about how to help this patient before me. And actually, there's a special variant of this sort of cold open style that doesn't even lead to a patient encounter, but is used to describe some sort of non-medical, often a travel experience. I don't see this as much as I did a few years ago when it really seemed common, but it's still not uncommon, especially from students from elite medical schools. So for that variant, you get something like this, tap, tap, tap. The guide tapped on the tent pole of my yurt, telling me it was time to go. I squinted my eyes to adjust to the pre-dawn darkness and arose, prepared to continue my trek across the Mongolian steppes. And in this video, I'm not going to give you advice about sounding self-absorbed, but I'll say the cold open style for medical encounters, it's perfectly okay. It provides a convenient literary vehicle that may capture some reader's attention. And if you want to use it, you really should, but you don't have to. And you don't have to have a patient encounter either. But describing an experience with a patient can be a nice way to convey your interest in the specialty and the kind of person you are, which again is one of the chief things that you're trying to accomplish in your personal statement. So you don't have to do it, but if you do, understand a few things. First, respect the patient. Do not provide unique patient identifiers, and make sure that the way that you describe the patient acknowledges their humanity and doesn't just describe them as some object for your own personal, professional, medical development. Second, be honest. Some applicants feel that in order to have a useful or compelling patient encounter, you've got to have some dramatic tale of medical mystery where you stepped in where others had failed and solved the mystery, saving the patient from a certain death. And you don't have to do that. Obviously, program directors know how medical students spend their time. And if you spin some yarn like that, it's going to sound like BS, even if it were 100% true. Actually, I think some of the very nicest personal statements that I've ever read describe something routine or even mundane. Because to be good at this job, you have to see and enjoy and learn from those little things. And telling a story of a time when you learned something simple, or you made a little mistake, or you shared a human moment with a patient, those things will probably resonate more with the person who's reading the personal statement because they've probably had those same experiences. And they've had them a lot more often than they've had the experience of snatching a life away from the jaws of death with nothing more than the knowledge that they used on USMLE Step 2CK. Time now to answer the most common question that I get about the personal statement. If you followed me on Twitter or X, you may have seen me respond to this one there too. Should I discuss my USMLE failure in my personal statement? Whenever this question comes up, it generates a lot of debate. And there's one side of this that says not only should you discuss it, but you're actually obligated to. The last time this came up on social media, there were a couple of program directors that jumped into the conversation to say, hey, this is your one shot. If I'm reading your personal statement, it is specifically because I want to hear what you have to say about this issue. And if you say nothing, you just blew your one chance with me, and there's no way that I'm going to interview you. But I'll tell you, I'm going to stick with my guns and assert that the average applicant should not do this. And there's at least 4 reasons why. Reason number 1 is that although there's definitely some vocal program directors who say that they want this, my feeling is that the actual number of people out there who feel that way is very, very low. And I say that because in reality, almost all the programs that really, really care about your USMLE score and they're really, really going to be turned off by USMLE failure, they ain't reading your personal statement. They've already screened you out on the front end because of that failure. So if you write your personal statement about failing the USMLE, I think you're doing it to try to appeal to a very small audience. Number 2 is that I'm actually skeptical that even that audience is going to be persuaded by what you have to say in your personal statement. Um, I mean, there certainly are some program directors who say that they want to see you atone for your failed USMLE. But what we don't know is how often those people are actually persuaded by anything that you might put in there. Maybe they say they want to see it, but it ultimately doesn't make them offer you an interview, or at least it doesn't make them offer you an interview very often. So now you're doing something to appeal to an even smaller part of the market. And I got to say, it's hard to strike the right tone when you're talking about something that's so difficult and embarrassing like this. And so you could write a personal statement that one PD might look at and say, oh yeah, they said just what I wanted to hear. And another person might look at it and say, oh, they didn't take enough ownership, or that was too over the top, or maybe it wasn't serious enough or contrite enough, or maybe you didn't grovel the way that they wanted you to, or whatever their objection is. It's hard to strike the right note. But even then, as I've pitched you reasons number 1 and number 2, you might say, well, there's some PDs who might be persuaded, so why shouldn't I do it? I mean, all you've told me so far is that the audience is small and maybe they'll be unconvinced. So let me give you reason number 3. which is that if you spend your time in the personal statement trying to atone for a USMLE failure, you miss the opportunity to spend that time selling some positive aspect of yourself. And so let me explicitly make the point that I kind of alluded to a moment ago, which is that if a program director is reading your personal statement, they're willing to look past the USMLE failure. Anyone who cared about it that much would have just screened you out, and they wouldn't be wasting their time reading the personal statement. So if you get to that point where your personal statement is actually being read by a human being who's willing to look past your USMLE failure, then I'm not sure that you don't get more fish on the hook by baiting them with something positive than you do by trying to explain away something negative. In reality, I think the best way to overcome a USMLE failure is by passing the test immediately on the next go-round, or by achieving a comfortably passing score on USMLE Step 2 CK if we're talking about a Step 1 failure, or with a strong Step 3 score if you're an international medical graduate, or by having strong academic performance elsewhere, because then you can soothe program directors' concerns about what they're really concerned about when they see a USMLE failure, which is that you're going to be an academic risk and you may not be able to pass the board exams. So I think even if you choose to write your personal statement about why you failed the USMLE, I think this is not an effective vehicle for getting at the real program director's concerns here. And it robs you of the opportunity to sell something else about yourself. But if that's not enough for you, then let me give you a fourth reason. Now here I'm going to shift gears a little bit because most of the advice that I give when I'm talking about residency application strategy, well, it's geared toward getting an interview. Because if you view this process through a strategic lens, that's the most important step. That's the bottleneck. If you don't get an interview, it's game over. Can't match at a program if you don't get an interview. But of course, the number of interviews that you get is really only a surrogate for the outcome that you really care about, which is matching. And even if talking about a USMLE failure did get you an additional interview or two, it may actually hurt you in terms of matching. And let me explain why. One thing that not all applicants realize is that the people who interview you, they may or may not have all of your application materials. At many programs, the faculty who interview you, they receive a limited amount of material because the program leadership wants them to really focus on you during the interview, and there are very good data that show that interviewers are biased by high or low USMLE scores when they're making an applicant's interview rating. So if you take the same applicant and their interviewer knows they scored a 275 on Step 2 CK, well then they start the interview with a favorable impression. Suddenly, that same applicant, they seem funnier and more personable and easier to get along with and more well-rounded. And gosh darn it, they're just a better overall fit for our program than somebody who had a 220, even if they interview just the same way. Many programs don't care about this. They want their interviewers to give them back an overall assessment of the applicant, tell us where to rank them. So they give them all the information that they might need to do that. But many programs don't. They actually want their faculty to evaluate the interviewee on the basis of the interview. So what they do is they blind the interviewers by giving them a packet of information that might not include all the stuff. Typical interviewers might get, maybe the ARIS CV and the letters of recommendation and the personal statement. But they don't get the MSPE because it includes grades and class rank, and they don't get the USMLE scores. And this is a very common practice at many programs. And if you happen to interview at a program that blinds their interviewers in this way, well, brother, you just unblinded yourself if you use your personal statement to explain how humbling it was to fail the USMLE. And that's probably going to hurt the way that they view your application overall, and it may end up lowering your rank and keeping you from matching altogether. So for all these reasons, my advice for most applicants is to not mention a USMLE failure in their personal statement. Or if you do feel compelled to mention it, then you make that mention brief. Now, you absolutely need to be prepared to discuss the failure at your interviews. And when you do, you want to show yourself to be a composed, mature person with a growth mindset who is not an academic risk and is unlikely to have a similar issue in the future. But I would use your personal statement to sell something else about yourself. Next question. Should I write program-specific personal statements? You certainly can if you want to. ARIS will let you upload as many personal statements as you need, so some applicants choose to create versions of their personal statement that name drop the name of the program as a way to get the program director's attention. It might be helpful. Um, I think that most of the time this does get noticed by the program director, so if you do it well, it's possible that it could open a door for you that otherwise might have been closed. Although I still have to wonder how impactful it's going to be in the world that we now live in when we have formal preference signaling and rampant away rotations and other ways that more credibly demonstrate an applicant's true interest in the program. But still, it could help. Now, the key thing, and I can't emphasize this strongly enough, is that if you're going to use multiple personal statements, they all need to be very well organized and they need to be very well labeled so that you are absolutely certain that you submit them each to the right program. I'll tell you, every year I see applicants where this goes wrong. The most common way that this kind of process goes wrong is when applicants apply to multiple specialties and they accidentally assign the other specialty's personal statement to their application to a certain program. But I can't tell you how unappealing it is to read a personal statement that's gushing about how, ever since they were a small child, they've wanted to be part of some specialty that's not what you actually train residents to be. But the other common way that it goes wrong is when an applicant has these multiple program-specific personal statements and they assign the wrong one, or they get lazy and they create all these different personal statements by using the find and replace function on their word processor, but that function doesn't find all of the references that were in the original personal statement. So for sake of example, I've seen a personal statement that I think was originally intended for the applicant to explain how the University of Virginia was their top choice program and how they desperately wanted to train there for various reasons. But then they recycled that personal statement by just clicking find and replace the words University of Virginia with the names of other programs. And that would have been fine, except that there was a place in the personal statement where they also referred to the program by its abbreviation, UVA. And the find and replace function doesn't find and replace things that are not exact matches. And I've seen the same thing when the program's name was misspelled or where the find and search didn't find variations where there was an apostrophe S. So if you want to do this, you can. And like I said, it could help. Just make sure that you go over your personal statements with a fine-toothed comb and label them clearly and unequivocally. And be absolutely certain that you assign them to the program that you intend to assign them to, because otherwise, this may end up hurting you. All right, our next question goes something like this. My personal statement won't fit on one page. Is it okay if I use a two-page personal statement? And my answer is no, definitely not. Based on absolutely zero data or evidence whatsoever, I'm going to authoritatively recommend to each of you that you take whatever measures necessary to fit your personal statement on a single printed page. Now, Eris will tempt you to write a longer personal statement. Actually, they allow up to 28,000 characters in your personal statement, which would probably be in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 pages if you actually wrote one that long. But nobody wants to read all that. So the overwhelming majority of Eris personal statements, they fit on one printed page. And those that don't, I mean, they may have a few lines dangling off on a second page, but the longest personal statement I can remember ever seeing was probably maybe a little bit more than a page and a half long. So there's no reason you can't have a longer personal statement. And actually, the logical part of my brain says there's probably no difference in the inference that a program director draws from the personal statement if it's exactly one page or maybe slightly longer. But the superstitious part of my brain says it looks better when you have it all on one page, and it looks weird when you don't. So if you want to write a longer personal statement, go for it. And if you want to submit your application on Friday the 13th and shatter a mirror right as you click submit, feel free to do that too. But I wouldn't. And I would humbly submit to you that any personal statement that has anything important to say can say that thing in a single written page. So try to edit one more time and get it down to a nice, clean 750 words or so that'll fit on one page. Time to move on to the last question. How do I make my personal statement better? I got a couple of questions that were very applicant specific and they're sort of difficult to categorize generally, but in answering them, it led me to emphasize a couple of points that I think are actually good advice for most applicants. So I'm going to pretend as though I were asked this exact question as a way to deliver those two pieces of wisdom to you. That first piece of wisdom is this: focus on the future. Some personal statements that end up reading kind of blah, they feel that way because they just recite things from the past, the things that got you to this point. But honestly, what's more exciting to programs is who you're going to become. That's a big reason that many program directors do this. I mean, they do it for the joy of seeing residents become. And you can tap into that emotional vein by having your personal statement build to that point. And at the very least, I think it's something that you want to touch on, the future. The second one is to read your personal statement out loud. This is such good advice, and you're here getting it for free on YouTube. It really is one of the most powerful techniques that you have to make your writing more powerful. So please don't miss the opportunity to use it to make your personal statement more engaging, digestible, and relevant for the people who are reading it. If you read your personal statement out loud and you're stumbling over the words, or you find that you're losing focus, or something sounds too long, or something sounds awkward, well, you just found the rough spots that need to be smoothed over. You want your personal statement to sound like you. Unless, that is, you sound like someone who's not serious or uses too much millennial slang. And in that case, you want to sound like a substantially similar person who's maybe a little bit more serious and doesn't use slang. But as long as you maintain a professional tone, I think you honestly want someone reading your personal statement to sound like in their head that they're having a conversation with you. They're hearing your real voice. And with that, I think I'm all out of advice, at least as far as the personal statement is concerned. Thanks again for listening.